Imagine a civilization so ancient that when the Roman Empire was at its peak, China had already risen and fallen multiple times. A culture so advanced that while Europe was in the Dark Ages, Chinese inventors were creating gunpowder, printing, and compasses that would eventually reshape the entire world. One continuous civilization spanning 5,000 years, more people than any nation on Earth. Four of the most important inventions in human history. Emperors who claimed to rule by divine mandate. Dynasties that rose to unimaginable heights and fell in apocalyptic violence. But here's what's truly shocking. China was on the verge of industrializing 500 years before Europe. They had everything: the technology, the resources, the knowledge. And then something happened. A decision was made that would cost them centuries of progress and nearly destroy them completely. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one civilization managed to survive for 5 millennia while every other ancient power fell. You'll discover why China invented gunpowder, but Europe conquered the world with it. And you'll learn about the century of humiliation that transformed China from the world's dominant power into a victim of colonialism, and how they're reclaiming that power today. But first, we need to go back, way back, to the Yellow River, where Chinese civilization was born, in legend and forged in reality. Chinese civilization claims to begin with the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, legendary rulers who taught humans agriculture, writing, and civilization itself. The Yellow Emperor Huangdi supposedly ruled around 2700 BCE and is considered the ancestor of all Chinese people. Are these real historical figures? Probably not, but they're incredibly important because they show us how Chinese civilization sees itself as ancient, continuous, and unified from the very beginning. The real archaeological evidence shows something more complex and more interesting. Around 10,000 BCE, people in the Yellow River Valley start farming. They're growing millet, raising pigs, making pottery. By 5000 BCE, they're building substantial villages with organized society. The Yellow River is called China's sorrow because it floods catastrophically, killing millions throughout history. But it's also China's cradle because those floods deposit nutrient-rich silt that makes the land incredibly fertile. Managing these floods required organization, cooperation, leadership. The very challenges of the Yellow River helped forge Chinese civilization. Traditional Chinese history says the first dynasty was the Xia, ruling from about 2070 to 1600 BCE. For centuries, scholars debated whether the Xia even existed or were purely legendary. Then archaeologists found the early Tu culture, Bronze Age sites with palace complexes, bronze weapons, and signs of centralized authority, dating to exactly when the Xia supposedly ruled. So maybe the Xia were real. Maybe the legends preserve actual history. Or maybe a later culture got mythologized into a founding dynasty. We still don't know for certain. But what we do know is that by 1600 BCE, there's no doubt China has a complex, literate civilization with a ruling dynasty. The Shang dynasty, 1600–1046 BCE, is where Chinese history becomes definitely real. We have their capital cities, their bronze weapons and ritual vessels, and most importantly, we have their writing. Oracle bones, turtle shells, and ox bones inscribed with early Chinese characters were used for divination. The Shang would write questions for the gods, apply heat, and interpret the cracks. These bones preserved the earliest Chinese writing, and it's already sophisticated, over 3,000 different characters. Here's what's remarkable. Modern Chinese characters are direct descendants of Shang Oracle bone script. A Chinese person today can look at 3,000-year-old writing and recognize some characters. That's cultural continuity that's almost unprecedented in human history. The Shang were warrior kings who practiced human sacrifice, maintained a powerful aristocracy, and controlled territory through force and ritual. They had bronze technology, horse-drawn chariots, and complex religious practices, but their rule was brutal. And when a dynasty becomes too oppressive in Chinese history, a pattern emerges, a pattern that will repeat for the next 3,000 years. In 1046 BCE, the Zhou people from the west rebelled against the Shang and won. But they had a problem. How do you justify overthrowing the rightful rulers? They invented the mandate of heaven. The concept is brilliant and will shape all of Chinese political history. Heaven grants the right to rule to virtuous leaders. When a ruler becomes corrupt or incompetent, heaven withdraws the mandate. Natural disasters, famines, rebellions. These are signs that the mandate is lost. Therefore, successful rebellion proves you had heaven's favor. The old dynasty lost the mandate, you gained it. You're not a rebel. You're the righteous founder of a new dynasty. This creates a cycle. Dynasty rises, rules well, becomes corrupt, loses mandate, rebellion, new dynasty. Over and over for 3,000 years. The mandate of heaven is why Chinese history is told in dynasties. It's the organizing principle of Chinese politics and why even today the Communist Party worries about maintaining legitimacy. The Zhou dynasty, 1046–256 BCE, is the longest in Chinese history, but it's divided into two very different periods. The Western Zhou, 1046–771 BCE, ruled through feudalism. They parceled out land to relatives and allies who ruled as semi-independent lords. It worked for a few centuries. Then the Eastern Zhou, 770–256 BCE, began after the capital was moved east, following a barbarian invasion. The Zhou kings became figureheads while their feudal lords gained real power. This led to the Spring and Autumn period, 770–476 BCE, and then the Warring States period, 476–221 BCE. China fragmented into competing kingdoms, waging constant warfare. It sounds like chaos, and it was, but it was also China's golden age of philosophy. During the chaos of the Warring States, Chinese thinkers tried to figure out how to create order, justice, and good government. Confucius, 551–479 BCE, taught that society works through proper relationships and moral behavior. Rulers should be virtuous. Children should respect parents. Everyone should know their role and fulfill it with integrity. Study the ancient classics. Practice ritual. Cultivate virtue. Confucianism becomes the defining philosophy of Chinese civilization for 2,000+ years. Laozi, possibly mythical, wrote the Tao Te Ching, founding Taoism. The Tao, the way, is the natural order. Don't force things. Go with the flow. The best ruler governs so naturally people barely notice. Simplicity, spontaneity, harmony with nature. Mozi taught universal love and practical ethics. Everyone should care for everyone equally. Reject wasteful rituals and warfare. The legalists said, human nature is selfish. You need strict laws, harsh punishments, and strong central authority. Morality is nice. Power is necessary. This debate, Confucian virtue versus legalist power, will shape Chinese politics forever. While philosophers debated, the warring kingdoms innovated militarily and administratively to survive. They developed iron weapons, crossbows, cavalry. They built walls, early versions of what becomes the Great Wall. They created bureaucracies to manage larger populations. They competed in agriculture, infrastructure, military technology. 7 major kingdoms dominated: Qin, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, and Qi. They formed alliances, betrayed each other, and fought for supremacy. By 230 BCE, one kingdom, Qin, was clearly winning. And in 221 BCE, they achieved what seemed impossible. They unified all of China under one ruler. His name was Qin Shi Huang, and he would create the template for imperial China. Qin Shi Huang, 259–210 BCE, didn't just conquer China, he transformed it. He standardized writing, one script for all China, currency, one money system, weights and measures, even the axle width of carts, so they'd fit the same ruts in roads. He built roads connecting his empire, canals for transportation, the early Great Wall, connecting and extending various walls, and his massive tomb complex with the terracotta army. He centralized power absolutely. No more feudalism. The empire was divided into provinces, ruled by appointed officials, not hereditary lords. This is the administrative model China uses even today. He burned books and buried scholars alive, or so the story goes, to eliminate dissent and alternative ideas. He particularly hated Confucians who criticized his legalist methods. But here's the thing. The Qin dynasty lasted only 15 years after unification. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, and his empire collapsed in rebellion by 206 BCE. He built too much, too fast. The brutal labor demands, building walls, roads, palaces, tombs, created massive resentment. His legalist harshness made him hated. The Qin dynasty fell, but the unified China he created would never disappear. The Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, is so important that ethnic Chinese still call themselves Han Chinese. This is when Chinese civilization consolidates its identity. The Han kept the Qin's administrative centralization, but softened the harshness. They adopted Confucianism as the state ideology, creating the Confucian bureaucracy that would last 2,000 years. Under Emperor Wu, 141–87 BCE, Han China expanded massively. They conquered parts of Korea and Vietnam, pushed west into Central Asia, opened the Silk Road trade routes to the west, and became one of the world's great empires. The Han developed paper, one of the 4 great inventions, advanced mathematics and astronomy, seismographs to detect earthquakes, water-powered mills, and standardized crossbow technology. This is when Chinese culture crystallizes. The classics are codified. Confucian education becomes the path to government service. The imperial examination system begins to take shape. China under the Han was as advanced as Rome under the Caesars. They were the 2 great empires on opposite ends of Eurasia, connected by the Silk Road but barely aware of each other. The Silk Road wasn't one road, but a network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, India, Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean. Chinese silk was desperately desired in Rome. Roman gold flowed east in payment, but also ideas, technologies, religions spread along these routes. Buddhism entered China via the Silk Road around the 1st century CE. It would transform Chinese culture. The Han controlled the eastern sections of the Silk Road, ensuring safe trade and collecting taxes. This brought enormous wealth, but maintaining control of Central Asia was expensive and difficult. Nomadic peoples constantly threatened, which brings us to a problem that will haunt Chinese history forever. North of China is the steppe, vast grasslands perfect for horses and herding, but not for farming. Nomadic peoples here developed cavalry culture and were militarily formidable. The Xiongnu, possibly ancestors of the Huns, were the Han dynasty's greatest external threat. Sometimes the Han fought them. Sometimes they paid tribute to maintain peace. Sometimes they sent Chinese princesses to marry nomadic chiefs, creating family alliances. This tension between settled agricultural China and nomadic steppe peoples is a constant theme. Sometimes China dominates. Sometimes the nomads conquer China. The Great Wall is built and rebuilt to manage this frontier. Remember this dynamic. It becomes crucial later when Mongols and Manchus actually conquer all of China. The Han dynasty fell into civil war and fragmented in 220 CE. What followed was the Three Kingdoms period, 220–280 CE. Three rival states fighting for supremacy. This period is dramatized in The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of China's greatest classical novels. The stories of brilliant strategists, loyal warriors, and political intrigue are known by every Chinese person. But romanticism aside, this was a catastrophic period. The population of China crashed from about 60 million under the Han to perhaps 16 million by the end of the wars. Disease, famine, and constant warfare devastated the land. China reunified briefly under the Jin dynasty, then fragmented again. For nearly 400 years, 220–589 CE, China experienced periodic division, foreign invasion, and instability. But something important happened during this chaos. Buddhism spread throughout China, transforming Chinese culture and philosophy. Buddhism arrived from India via the Silk Road and gradually became deeply embedded in Chinese culture, blending with Taoism and Confucianism. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning, art, and charity. The religion provided comfort during unstable times, teaching that suffering could be transcended through enlightenment. Chinese Buddhism developed its own distinctive forms. Chan Buddhism, which became Zen in Japan, Pure Land Buddhism, focusing on Amitabha Buddha, and Chinese Buddhist art and architecture, pagodas, cave temples. By 500 CE, Buddhism was thoroughly Chinese. This is important because it shows Chinese culture's ability to absorb foreign ideas and make them Chinese. Sinicization. In 589 CE, the Sui dynasty reunified China after nearly 400 years of division. Like the Qin before them, they were short-lived, 589–618 CE, but transformative. Emperor Yang built the Grand Canal, over 1,100 miles of artificial waterways connecting northern and southern China. It's an engineering marvel that facilitated trade and united the economy. But like Qin Shi Huang, he overreached. Massive construction projects and failed military campaigns exhausted the empire. Rebellion erupted and the Sui fell. But they'd reunified China, and the dynasty that came next would take that unified China to unprecedented heights. The Tang dynasty, 618–907 CE, is often considered China's greatest period. This is when Chinese civilization reaches its classical peak. The Tang capital, Chang'an, modern Xi'an, was the world's largest city, over 1 million people. It was cosmopolitan, filled with foreign merchants, Persian traders, Arab Muslims, Indian monks, Korean students, Japanese ambassadors. Tang China was confident. outward-looking, and culturally dominant across East Asia. Korea, Japan, and Vietnam all look to China as the cultural model. Tang achievements include poetry reached its peak, Li Bai, Du Fu, greatest Chinese poets. Buddhism flourished, though later persecuted. Art and ceramics, Tang three-color pottery. Military expansion, briefly controlling parts of Central Asia, and the imperial examination system matured. Meritocratic bureaucracy. Women had relatively high status in Tang China. Empress Wu Zetian, 690–705 CE, was China's only female emperor, ruling in her own right, not as regent. This was unprecedented and wouldn't happen again. The Tang showed what Chinese civilization could achieve when stable, prosperous, and open to the world. In 755 CE, disaster struck, and Lu Shan, a Tang general, rebelled with 200,000 troops. The rebellion lasted 8 years and devastated northern China. The Tang survived, but barely. The census before the rebellion, 53 million people. After, 17 million. Whether from death or refugee flight. The demographic catastrophe was staggering. The Tang never fully recovered. They lost control of Central Asia. The government weakened. Power shifted to regional military governors. The dynasty limped along until 907 CE, but its golden age was over. After the Tang fell, China fragmented again, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. Then the Song dynasty, 960–1279 CE, reunified most of China. The Song never matched the Tang military power or territorial extent. The northern nomads, Khitan, then Jurchen, controlled northern China. The Song were confined to the south, but economically and technologically, the Song were revolutionary. The Song innovations include gunpowder weapons, invented during Tang, weaponized under Song. Printing, movable type, though used earlier, became widespread. Compass for navigation, revolutionizing maritime trade, and paper money, world's first. These are 3 of the 4 great inventions, with paper from Han. They would eventually transform the world, but ironically, not for China. The Song economy boomed, cities grew, maritime trade flourished. An early industrial revolution seemed possible. Iron production, coal use, mechanical engineering, all advanced. The Song had everything needed for industrialization: technology, resources, capital, large markets. So why didn't they industrialize? This is the question I teased at the beginning. We'll answer it in about 20 minutes. But first, we need to talk about what actually ended the Song. In 1206, Temujin united the Mongol tribes and took the title Genghis Khan. By his death in 1227, he'd conquered most of Central Asia. His grandson Kublai Khan continued the expansion. In 1279, the Mongols conquered all of Song China, establishing the Yuan dynasty, 1271–1368. For the first time, all of China was ruled by foreign conquerors. The Mongols were militarily supreme, but culturally different. They were steppe nomads, ruling an agricultural empire. They employed Chinese bureaucrats, but didn't fully adopt Chinese culture. Kublai Khan established his capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, built palaces, patronized arts. He tried to invade Japan. Failed. Typhoons destroyed his fleets. He welcomed foreign visitors, including Marco Polo, whose account introduced China to Europe. But Mongol rule never gained full legitimacy. They were foreign. The mandate of heaven was in question. In 1368, Chinese rebels overthrew the Mongols and established the Ming dynasty. The Ming, 1368–1644, presented themselves as restoring authentic Chinese civilization after Mongol rule. Early Ming achievements include they rebuilt the Great Wall, the version tourists visit today, moved the capital to Beijing, and built the Forbidden City, compiled the Yongle Encyclopedia, largest encyclopedia in the world, and sponsored massive maritime expeditions. The Zheng He voyages, 1405–1433, are crucial to our story. Admiral Zheng He commanded fleets of massive treasure ships, some over 400 feet long, with crews of 27,000 men. They sailed to Southeast Asia, India, Persia, Arabia, and East Africa. These voyages demonstrated Chinese naval supremacy and brought back tribute and trade goods. China was projecting power across the Indian Ocean, decades before Europeans figured out how to reach India. And then suddenly, it stopped. In 1433, the Ming Emperor ordered an end to the treasure voyages. The ships were left to rot. Maritime trade was restricted. China turned inward. Why? The Confucian bureaucrats won a political argument. They believed the voyages were wasteful. Resources should support agriculture and defense against northern nomads, not pointless naval adventures. Trade with barbarians was beneath China's dignity. Traditional Confucian values emphasized land, not sea. This decision, choosing Confucian conservatism over commercial expansion, is one of history's great turning points. At exactly the moment China withdrew from the seas, Europeans were beginning their age of exploration. In 1492, just 59 years after China's last treasure voyage, Columbus reached America. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. While China turned inward, Europe turned outward. The consequences would be catastrophic for China. So here's the answer to that question. Why didn't China industrialize, despite having the technology? Political and cultural conservatism. The Confucian scholar official class dominated Chinese government. They valued agricultural stability over commercial risk, classical learning over technological innovation, social harmony over disruptive change, and tradition over experimentation. Merchants had low social status in Confucian hierarchy. Innovation that might disrupt the social order was discouraged. The examination system produced brilliant classical scholars, not engineers or entrepreneurs. This worked beautifully for maintaining a stable agrarian empire. It was disaster for competing with early modern Europe's dynamism. China had the technology, but not the culture or political system to exploit it. Europe had less sophisticated technology initially, but a culture of competition, innovation, and expansion. This cultural difference would doom China to a century of humiliation. In 1644, the Ming fell to a combination of internal rebellion and external invasion. The Manchus, another northern nomadic people, conquered China and established the Qing dynasty, 1644–1912. Like the Mongols before them, the Manchus were foreign conquerors, but they were smarter about ruling China. They adopted Chinese culture extensively while maintaining distinct Manchu identity. The Qing forced Chinese men to wear the queue, braided ponytail, as a sign of submission. If you cut your hair, you were a rebel. Under Emperors Kangxi, 1661–1722, Yongzheng, 1722–1735, and Qianlong, 1735 and 1796, the Qing reached their peak. They conquered vast territories, Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan. Population exploded from 100 million to 400 million. Economy prospered. Arts flourished. By 1800, the Qing Empire was the wealthiest and most populous nation on Earth. China represented about 35% of global GDP. And then everything fell apart. Britain had a problem. They wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But China wanted nothing from Britain. Trade deficits drained British silver. The British solution? Opium. British merchants began smuggling opium from India into China. Millions became addicted. Silver now flowed out of China to pay for the drug. The Qing government tried to stop it. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu destroyed 1,000 tons of British opium in Guangzhou. Britain responded with war. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, was a catastrophe for China. British ships and weapons were technologically superior. They bombarded coastal cities, blockaded ports, and forced China to surrender. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, paid massive indemnity to Britain, and gave Britain special legal privileges, extraterritoriality. This was China's first unequal treaty, terms dictated by a foreign power that violated Chinese sovereignty. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, was even worse. British and French forces captured Beijing and burned the old Summer Palace, destroying priceless cultural treasures in an act of deliberate cultural vandalism. China, the world's oldest continuous civilization, was being humiliated by foreign barbarians. As if foreign invasion wasn't enough, internal rebellion nearly destroyed China. Hong Xiuquan, a failed examination candidate, claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ and led a Christian-influenced rebellion against the Qing. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850-1864, created a massive death toll. Estimates range from 20 to 30 million people. Entire provinces were devastated. The Qing barely survived, but only with foreign help. The same Western powers humiliating China also helped suppress the rebellion because they wanted a weak Qing government they could manipulate, not total chaos. China's weakness was now obvious to everyone. Between 1840 and 1950, China experienced what Chinese call the century of humiliation. Foreign powers carved out spheres of influence. Britain controlled Hong Kong and parts of central China. France took Indochina and southern China influence. Germany seized Qingdao. Russia took Manchuria and northern territories. Japan took Korea and Taiwan. China lost wars to everyone. The Sino-Japanese War, 1894-1895, was particularly humiliating. Losing to Japan, a country China had historically considered culturally inferior. Foreign concessions in Chinese cities operated under foreign law. Chinese people in their own country had fewer rights than foreigners. Racism and exploitation were rampant. The Qing tried reforms, the self-strengthening movement, the 100 Days Reform, but couldn't overcome conservative resistance and foreign interference. China, once the world's greatest civilization, had become the sick man of Asia. In 1900, a movement called the Boxers, Chinese martial artists with traditional beliefs, rose up against foreign influence. They attacked foreign missionaries, Chinese Christians, and foreign diplomats. 8 foreign nations, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, USA, Japan, Italy, Austria-Hungary, sent 20,000 troops to Beijing, defeated the Boxers, and forced China to pay crushing indemnities. The foreign powers literally occupied Beijing. The emperor fled. Chinese sovereignty was a joke. In 1911, revolution finally toppled the Qing. The last emperor, Puyi, a child, abdicated in 1912. After 2,000 years, imperial China was over. But what came next was chaos, not salvation. Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary leader, became provisional president of the Republic of China in 1912. He had three principles: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. But the Republic was weak from birth. Regional warlords controlled their own armies. The government in Beijing couldn't enforce authority. Japan was aggressively expanding in China. In 1916, Sun stepped down and warlord era began. For over a decade, China fragmented into regions controlled by military strongmen. It was like the Warring States all over again. In 1919, Chinese intellectuals were outraged when the Treaty of Versailles gave German concessions in China to Japan instead of returning them to China. The May 4th movement erupted, students and intellectuals demanding modernization, rejecting traditional Confucianism, embracing Western ideas like democracy and science. Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy became the slogan. Chinese intellectuals believed Confucian tradition had weakened China. They needed radical cultural transformation. This movement set the stage for the political upheavals to come. Two forces emerged to reunify China: the nationalists, Kuomintang, KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek after Sun Yat-sen's death. They claimed Sun's legacy and sought to reunify China under a centralized republic. The Communists, CCP, founded in 1921, inspired by the Russian Revolution. Mao Zedong emerged as a leader, adapting communist theory to Chinese conditions, focusing on peasants instead of urban workers. Initially, they allied against warlords. By 1927, they were at war with each other. The nationalists nearly won. In 1934, they surrounded the communist forces. The communists broke out and conducted the Long March, 6,000 miles of retreat across China's harshest terrain. Of 80,000 who started, only 8,000 arrived in Shanxi province. But they survived, and Mao's leadership during the Long March established his authority. In 1937, Japan launched full-scale invasion of China. What followed was one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. The rape of Nanking, 1937, Japanese troops massacred between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers in an orgy of violence. The war consumed China. The nationalists retreated to Chongqing in the interior. The communists conducted guerrilla warfare. Tens of millions died. The nationalists and communists officially allied against Japan, but spent much of the war positioning for the civil war they knew would resume when Japan was defeated. When WTWT ended in 1945 with Japan's surrender, China was devastated but victorious. It should have been time to rebuild. Instead, civil war immediately resumed. The Civil War 1945-1949 ended in communist victory. The nationalists were corrupt, losing popular support. The communists had effective organization and appealed to peasants with promises of land reform. By 1949, the nationalists fled to Taiwan. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and declared, "The Chinese people have stood up." The People's Republic of China was born. After a century of humiliation, China was finally unified, independent, and under strong central government. But at what cost? And what would communist rule mean? Mao transformed China through radical campaigns: land reform, 1950-1952, redistributed land from landlords to peasants. Between 1 to 2 million landlords killed. The Great Leap Forward, 1958-1962, attempt to rapidly industrialize through collectivization and backyard steel furnaces. It was a catastrophic failure. Famine killed 15 to 45 million people, possibly the largest famine in human history. The Cultural Revolution, 1966–1976, Mao unleashed Red Guards, radical youth, to purge bourgeois elements and revive revolutionary fervor. Schools closed. Intellectuals were persecuted. Temples destroyed. Chaos reigned. Perhaps 1 to 2 million died. Countless lives ruined. Mao's rule was transformative, but catastrophically destructive. He unified China and made it independent, but his utopian experiments caused immense suffering. When Mao died in 1976, China was still poor, isolated, and traumatized. Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978 and pragmatically asked, "Does it matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice?" He opened China to market economics while maintaining Communist Party political control. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, essentially capitalism overseen by communist authoritarianism. The results: special economic zones attracted foreign investment. Private enterprise encouraged. Agriculture decollectivized. Technology transferred from abroad. GDP growth averaged 10% annually for decades. China transformed from impoverished to the world's second-largest economy in one generation. Hundreds of millions lifted from poverty. Cities modernized. Infrastructure exploded. But political reform didn't accompany economic reform. In 1989, students occupied Tiananmen Square, demanding democracy, free speech, and anti-corruption measures. The government debated how to respond. Hardliners won. On June 4, 1989, tanks rolled into Beijing. Hundreds, possibly thousands, killed. The message was clear. Economic modernization, yes. Political liberalization, no. Western nations condemned China, imposed sanctions, but within a few years, economic engagement resumed. China was too important to isolate. From the 1990s to present, China's rise has been staggering. Joined WTO in 2001, hosted Olympics in 2008, became world's largest trader, built world's largest high-speed rail network, led in renewable energy investment, advanced in technology, 5G, AI, quantum computing. Belt and Road Initiative, New Silk Road, connecting China to world. In 2010, China passed Japan as world's second-largest economy. Some projections suggest China could pass the US as largest economy by 2030, 2040. Under Xi Jinping, 2012 present, China has become more assertive, more nationalistic, tighter political control, more aggressive foreign policy, technological ambitions, Made in China 2025. Military modernization. China is reclaiming the central position it held for most of history. The century of humiliation is over. China has stood up. We've traveled from the Yellow River to Tiananmen Square, from oracle bones to artificial intelligence, from the first emperor to Xi Jinping. Chinese civilization has survived 5,000 years, while other ancient civilizations fell, invented technologies that changed the world, created philosophies that shaped a quarter of humanity, built the world's longest-lasting bureaucratic empire, endured catastrophic rebellions, foreign conquest, and civil war, fallen from global dominance to humiliation, and risen again to challenge for world leadership. What explains this continuity? How did Chinese civilization survive when Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, and others disappeared? Geography. The Yellow and Yangtze River valleys provided rich agricultural land protected by mountains, deserts, and ocean. This created a natural unified zone. Writing. Chinese characters can be read regardless of spoken dialect. A Cantonese speaker and Mandarin speaker can't understand each other's speech, but they can read the same text. Writing unified culture across space and time. The mandate of heaven. This concept provided flexibility. Dynasties could fall and new ones rise without destroying the civilization itself. The system adapted while maintaining continuity. Confucian bureaucracy. The examination system created a shared elite culture across generations. Officials studied the same classics, shared the same values, perpetuated the same system. Cultural confidence. Even when conquered by Mongols and Manchus, Chinese culture was so strong that the conquerors adopted it. The conquered absorbed the conquerors. Pragmatism. Chinese civilization has repeatedly shown ability to adapt foreign ideas, Buddhism, now capitalism, and make them Chinese. Flexibility within continuity. These factors combined to create resilience. China could fall and rise, fragment and reunify, but the core civilization persisted. First, civilizations can decline, but also recover. The century of humiliation seemed terminal. China was dismissed as finished. Now they're challenging US dominance. Never underestimate long-term historical forces. Second, technology alone doesn't guarantee success. Song China had gunpowder, printing, and compasses centuries before Europe effectively used them. Culture and institutions matter as much as innovation. Third, turning inward has costs. Ming China's decision to end maritime expeditions and restrict trade arguably cost them centuries of development. Openness to the world matters. Fourth, political legitimacy in China still depends on performance. The Communist Party maintains control not just through repression, but by delivering economic growth and national pride. The mandate of heaven survives in new form. Fifth, historical grievance shapes current behavior. The century of humiliation isn't ancient history to Chinese, it's living memory that motivates current nationalism and assertiveness. Sixth, China's rise isn't unprecedented, it's a return to historical norms. For most of the past 2,000 years, China was the world's largest economy and most advanced civilization. The 19th-20th century decline was the aberration, not the current rise. Where is China headed? That's the question shaping the 21st century. The optimistic view: China continues rising peacefully, lifting more people from poverty, contributing to human knowledge and technology, integrating into global systems, gradually liberalizing politically. The pessimistic view: authoritarian control tightens, nationalism becomes aggressive, military conflict over Taiwan or South China Sea, economic model becomes unsustainable. Environmental problems create crisis. Global pushback contains Chinese power. The realistic view: probably something in between. China will continue growing in power, but face significant challenges: aging population, environmental degradation, political rigidity, international resistance. The path won't be smooth, but the trajectory is clearly upward. One thing is certain: China's story isn't over. After 5,000 years, this civilization is still writing its history, and that history will shape all of our futures. If you want to understand China today, you need to understand its history. Why is China so concerned with territorial integrity? Because they remember the century of humiliation when foreign powers carved up their country. Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet. These aren't just territories. They're symbols of whether China controls its own destiny. Why does China reject Western political criticism? Because they remember Western powers lecturing them about civilization while forcing opium on them and burning their palaces. They see Western human rights concerns as hypocritical and self-serving. Why is China building the Belt and Road? Because they remember the Silk Road when China was the center of Asian trade. They're recreating the tributary system where neighboring nations acknowledge Chinese centrality in exchange for economic benefits. Why does China invest so heavily in technology? Because they remember being technologically backward during the Opium Wars and losing as a result. Never again will they let others have a decisive technological advantage. Why is the Communist Party so paranoid about stability? Because they remember the warlord era, the Civil War, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. They've seen how quickly order can collapse in China, and they're determined to prevent it. Why does China care so much about national pride and face? Because they remember being humiliated for a century, treated as inferior, mocked as the sick man of Asia. They're determined to restore Chinese dignity and respect. China's present is shaped by its past. You can't understand one without the other. China today is a paradox, simultaneously ancient and ultra-modern. They have 5,000 years of history, but cities that look like the future. They quote Confucius while building AI. They're ruled by a communist party that acts like an emperor claiming the mandate of heaven. They're the world's factory and a rising technological power. They're assertively nationalist and deeply integrated into global systems. This is because China never cleanly broke with its past. They didn't have a renaissance separating ancient and modern. They didn't have an enlightenment replacing traditional thought with reason. They didn't have industrialization organically transforming their society. Instead, they tried to rapidly modernize while maintaining civilizational continuity, to take the ancient Chinese state and make it work in the modern world, to remain Chinese while becoming modern. This creates tensions and contradictions, but it also creates something unique, a civilization that's older than any other still functioning political entity, now wielding 21st century power. Even if you're not Chinese, China's history matters to you because, economically, China is in your supply chain. Your phone, computer, clothes, probably made in China. Their economic choices affect global markets. Politically, China's model of authoritarian capitalism challenges Western democratic capitalism. If China succeeds, it suggests democracy isn't necessary for prosperity, a dangerous idea for liberal values. Technologically, China leads in areas like 5G, AI, renewable energy. Their technological choices will shape global standards. Environmentally, China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but also the largest investor in renewable energy. What they do determines whether we can address climate change. Militarily, China is building a world-class military and asserting territorial claims. US-China rivalry could define global politics for decades. China's choices will affect everyone on Earth. Understanding why they make those choices requires understanding their history. We've reached the end of this video, but not the end of China's story. Right now, as you watch this, China is building cities, developing technologies, training students, conducting diplomacy, projecting power, making decisions that will echo through history. The Chinese people, 1.4 billion of them, are living through another chapter of the world's longest-running civilization. They're asking the same questions their ancestors asked. How do we maintain order? How do we prosper? How do we restore China's rightful place in the world? The answers they find will shape the 21st century just as China shaped previous centuries. 5,000 years from the Yellow River to today, from oracle bones to quantum computers, from the first emperor to Xi Jinping, from isolated Middle Kingdom to global superpower. This is China, ancient and modern, powerful and insecure, proud and aggrieved, traditional and innovative, peaceful and assertive. This is the civilization that invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass, that built the Great Wall and the Forbidden City, that survived the Mongols and the century of humiliation, that rose from poverty to power in one generation. This is the country that contains more history than any other, more people than any other, more ambition than any other. This is China, and its story is far from over. We've covered 5,000 years in 90 minutes, from mythical emperors to modern megacities, from oracle bones to artificial intelligence, from isolation to global power. China's history shows us that civilizations can endure for millennia, that they can fall and rise again, that historical grievances shape present behavior, and that the past is never truly past. The Chinese civilization that built the Great Wall and invented gunpowder is the same civilization now building the Belt and Road and developing quantum technology. Different era, same civilization. That's what makes China unique. Thanks for joining me on this journey through 5,000 years. If you want to understand the world we live in, the economic competition, the technological rivalry, the geopolitical tensions, you need to understand Chinese history. Because China remembers. They remember when they were the world's center. They remember when they were humiliated. And they remember that civilizations rise, fall, and rise again. And right now, China is rising.